State capacity refers to the state's ability to perform its functions and implement policy. This encompasses activities such as tax collection, law enforcement, and public goods provision, all of which are essential for economic development. But states don't emerge fully formed. State capacity builds and expands over time, and this itself may affect economic outcomes. This paper traces the dynamic consequences of state building and studies one of history's most ambitious state-building experiments, the administrative reform initiated by the French Revolution. Prior to this, the French kingdom was governed through a complex, multi-layered system with around 800 local administrative centers. Citizens commonly relied on multiple jurisdictions for different services, and grievances over administrative complexity were widespread. As a result, in February 1790, France's first Constituent Assembly radically reorganized the state. To ensure all citizens were no more than a day's travel away from their administrative center, they divided the country into 83 homogeneous units, each with its own capital performing all state functions. But because the process of selecting capitals was often contentious, the reform stipulated that in a subset of departments, administrative functions would rotate between multiple cities. This system was ultimately abandoned in 1791 when the Assembly abolished rotations and ordered the local capital to remain where it was currently located. The authors use this quasi-random selection to estimate the causal effects of state building. They compare final capitals with candidate cities and trace both the short and long-term evolution of three dimensions of state capacity. Extractive capacity is the state's ability to obtain contributions from its citizens. Enforcement capacity is the ability to enforce the law, and productive capacity is the ability to provide public goods. These aspects of state capacity are interdependent. Extractive and enforcement capacity, which comprise the coercive capacity of the state, are inputs in the production of public goods. This fact shapes the dynamic effects of state building. Using a simple model, the authors show that actions such as the 1790 reform can trigger investments in the coercive capacity of the state long before they deliver economic benefits. In the model, once a city is designated a capital, it invests in building its coercive capacity by levying higher taxes relative to other cities. This initially drives citizens away, but in time, early investments in coercive capacity translate into higher levels of productive capacity. Capitals are able to increase their provision of local public goods, and in the long term, this leads to higher productivity and population growth. And these patterns do appear in the French setting. Prior to the 1790 reform, capitals are no different from other candidate cities. But after their final designation, gaps in extractive capacity begin to open. Capitals are 60 percentage points more likely to have their first cadastre established by 1815, and their citizens pay more business tax per establishment according to the first industrial census in 1839. They also send more men to Napoleonic armies between 1802 and 1815, despite being no more populated than comparable candidate cities. Alongside these changes in extractive capacity, there is also a rapid increase in enforcement capacity. Capitals have more prisons and tribunals as early as 1820 and have larger police forces by 1816. But in contrast to these short-term increases in coercive capacity, effects on productive capacity only appear later. Capitals are more likely to have a secondary school, but this effect is only present after 1850. Similarly, there are medium-term effects on the provision of social services and infrastructure such as telegraph networks and train stations. These patterns are consistent with the idea that the benefits of state building are delayed as resources are initially invested in building the state's coercive capacity. But over time, substantial benefits do materialize. In the medium and long term, capitals experience greater development and growth, likely due to their increased investment in public goods. They have greater access to banks, and their economic divergence relative to candidate cities widens over the second half of the 19th century. More patents are registered by citizens of capitals starting around 1870, and there are sizable effects on population growth. On the eve of World War I, capitals are around 40% more populated than candidate cities, and by 1999 they are markedly different in both demographic and economic terms. And so, this episode illustrates the dynamic consequences of state building. Cities chosen as capitals in 1790 ended up outgrowing their otherwise similar competitors, but these effects only materialized over time. In the short term, citizens living in or near capitals were more exposed to the state's coercive capacity, as embodied by higher levels of taxation and military conscription. As a final point, the authors note that while these investments in state capacity ultimately paid off, this isn't always the case. Other research shows that the process of state building can unfold differently if, for example, the initial buildup in coercive capacity is so large as to prevent the emergence of a cohesive society. In different settings, many factors can shape the dynamics of state building. To read more on this topic, you can check out the paper's references to other related work. These include papers on the economic consequences of the French Revolution, as well as research on state capacity and public goods provision.